Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Today's message comes from the passages in Numbers 35 and Joshua 20. It's about the cities of refuge and discusses how God is our refuge in our day. I want to start with a true story. It was a young lady occasionally walked through the park after work, and she stopped to have her picture taken by a photographer. You know, sometimes they take your picture, and for money they'll do a little frame for you, And so on that particular day, she stopped, and this photographer takes her picture, and she was very excited about it. And she walked out of the park. She looked at the Polaroid, and she was in amazement and or astonishment. And she turned and headed back to the cameraman. And when she got there, she yelled at him. And she said, "This is not right. This is not right. You have not done me justice." And the photographer looked at the picture and looked at her, and he said, "Miss, you don't need justice. What you need is mercy." Today, as we look at these cities of refuge in Numbers 35 and Joshua 20, we'll explore the mercy of God and God as our refuge. The cities of refuge were meant to be places of safety. So today's message is called Safe Haven, a place of safety. In those days, 3,000 years ago, the justice system was sadly lacking. And what these cities of refuge did was to provide a real step in that system. If a person accidentally killed another person, that person could run away from the victim's family while waiting for the priest to declare him or her not guilty. After all, a person wants to avenge their loved one's death. And if you haven't already got some sort of legal system in place, revenge was the most natural way to go. Now, these cities of refuge were God's plan to show the people mercy on those who needed it at that time. Because if this wasn't in place and somebody accidentally died because of someone else's fault. For example, they're building something and a big stone falls off and hits somebody on the head and they die. It doesn't matter that it's an accident. The family wants to take revenge. The father, the older brother, somebody's coming after you with a spear or a sword and want to take care of this. And they're fueled with anger and heartbreak. And it's not that justice would not be served here, in that the cities were intended to show God's mercy. What the cities show, in fact, is that God's mercy extends a lot further than people's mercy. If we look at Isaiah chapter 21, verse 4, it uses a lot of descriptions. Isaiah 21, verse 4 says, "You have been a refuge for the poor, a refuge for the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm, and a shade from the heat." A refuge, a shelter, a shade. All of these show the mercy of God. How we can turn to Him when the world seeks to destroy us, or to mock us, or to intimidate us, or to pressure us. Even if the whole world is against you, God is for you, and He wants to strengthen you in your time of trouble. Psalm 46 says, "God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble." In the early 1920s, in this country, there was a black jazz musician from Atlanta called Thomas Dorsey. And he was known for the suggestive lyrics that he combined with original music. But then God touched his life in 1926. And he gave up the suggestive music and began to write spiritual music. And in 1932, times were hard for Dorsey, as they were for nearly everyone trying to survive in the Great Depression. And perhaps it was because of his past music and his music style. Some said his music was too worldly. The most difficult night of his life came one night there in St. Louis when he received a telegram telling him that his pregnant wife had suddenly died. Dorsey was filled with grief and his faith was shaken. But instead of wallowing in self-pity, he expressed his agony the only way he knew how. He wrote a song. And the words from that song say this: "Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through storm, through night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call. Hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home." In spite of Dorsey's checkered past, he experienced God's presence during that crisis in his life. That song, which came out of his pain and grief, has comforted and challenged thousands upon thousands of people. Because if we're honest, if we really are honest, most of us have had a moment or two when God's presence was all that could get us through. There was just nothing else. But let's be honest about something else. We don't really deserve God's faithfulness. Because if we're all honest, all of us have to admit we haven't always been faithful to Him. Let's go to Joshua chapter 20, beginning verse 1. I'll read them for you if you like. You can follow along in your Bible. "Then Adonai spoke to Joshua, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, Designate your cities of refuge, about which I spoke to you through Moses. So the manslayer who kills any person by mistake and without premeditation may flee there. They will be your refuge from the avenger of blood." The avenger of blood. "When one flees to one of those cities, he must stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and state his case in the hearing of the elders of that city. Then they are to take him into their city and give him a place to live among them. Now if the blood avenger pursues him, then they will not hand the manslayer over to him, since he killed his neighbor without premeditation and did not hate him beforehand. So he will stay in that city until he can stand trial before the congregation, or until the death of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, in those days. And then the manslayer may return to his own city and to his own house, to the city from which he had fled." And so they set apart Kadesh in Galilee, in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. And across the Jordan, east of Jericho, they designated Bezer in the wilderness, on the tableland, from the tribe of Reuben. Ramoth in Gilead, from the tribe of Gad. And Golan in Bashan, from the tribe of Manasseh. And these were appointed cities for all of the children of Israel, and for the outsider who was dwelling among them, so that whoever kills any person unintentionally might flee there and not die by the hand of the blood avenger, before standing trial before the congregation. Now the laws of the cities of refuge, found in Numbers 35, Deuteronomy 4, and Jeremiah 20. Joshua 20. They introduce the concept of this term, the blood avenger, the avenger of blood. Very interesting. Most people today hear the word avenger, they're thinking of Captain America or something. But in the ancient Near East, particularly in the tribal economies, where organized systems of justice and government were not always in place, or if they were in place, they weren't consistent. And society kept homicide in check by means of a cultural institution called Goel Hadam, Redeemer of the Blood, also translated Blood Avenger. This indicates that vengeance is part of the biblical concept of redemption. Goel means redeemer. A redeemer is a kinsman responsible for redeeming or avenging family members, protecting the family interest, purchasing family members back from slavery or debt, restoring tribal land and property that has fallen outside the family, and even marrying the childless widow of a deceased kinsman. Sometimes they're referred to as a kinsman redeemer. One's redeemer is one's next of kin, brother, father, uncle, cousin. And in the tribal economy of the ancient Near East, when lawlessness often prevailed, the redemption system of justice discouraged murder and violence. If you killed a man, you could be certain the redeemer of his blood would come looking for you. There was no mistake. There was no if. A murderer lived like a hunted man for the rest of his life. The blood avenger role of the Goel was not an institution created by the Torah. It wasn't created by God. Instead, the Torah makes laws governing the already existing social institution of the time. The vigilante avenger operated as a court of one, judge, jury, and executioner. Ancient social norms allowed the Redeemer to carry out that vengeance without any consequences at all. And the Torah offers laws creating cities of refuge and courts of law to curtail blood redemption. Today we call that type of killing a crime of passion. You killed my so-and-so, and now I'm going to get you. And that seems right in some people's mind. And God, He wanted a different way. When a murder had been committed, whether intentionally or accidentally, the city of refuge granted the murderer asylum so that he could survive long enough to be tried by a court. That's all that was about. Because if the victim's family member found him, he was dead on the spot. Wait a minute, let me explain. Here, this is my new sword. Can you hold this for me? Numbers 35 verse 12 states this: the cities shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer will not die until he stands before the congregation for trial. If the court found him guilty, the cities of refuge turned him over to the avenger. You hear that? If he was found guilty, the courts would turn him over to the avenger. You did it. You committed murder. The person didn't die unintentionally. You premeditated this, and you went and you killed him. So, I want you to meet your friend. You guys have fun together. You've got nothing but the clothes on your back. He's got 42 swords, 3 spears, and 76 knives, and a bunch of attack dogs. And you guys play nice. Wow. If the court found that the murder was unintentional, the city of refuge granted the man permanent asylum. Deuteronomy 19 gives examples such as the loose axe head. A person's chopping wood or something, the axe head flies off and kills somebody. It's completely accidental. It wasn't planned. Whoops! Oh my God, what happened? But the family member of that person, how did he die? Did he fall off a cliff or something? No. This guy was chopping wood and the axe head flew off and hit him. How do we know he didn't swing it that way on purpose and it didn't matter, and he'd be upset about it and he'd want to kill that guy so he could flee to the city of refuge and be safe from the blood avenger. If he stayed, though, outside those walls and the blood avenger came across him, he forfeited his life. The guy said, I can't take it in the city anymore. I got to go for a walk. He went through the gate, walked outside. If the guy was waiting for him, it was goodbye, Charlie. Numbers 35, verses 26 to 28 says this: But the manslayer at any time goes beyond the border of his city of refuge to which he may flee. Then the blood avenger finds him outside the border of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer. He will not be guilty of blood because he should have remained in his city of refuge. You see, the Torah presents a higher form of justice which employs a trial by judges with the testifying witnesses as the ones required to cast the first stones. The legislation about city of refuge created a compromise within the ancient Near Eastern institution of blood avenger. Now, metaphorically speaking, the Messiah offers us a city of refuge from the punishment of our own guilt. The adversary pursues us like a blood avenger, and eventually death overtakes us. Messiah grants us safe haven within the walls of God's refuge. So long as we remain within these walls of God's refuge, we need not fear the one who roams about the world like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. God has always offered refuge and mercy. The nation of Israel, at this point, had an army, by the way, but it didn't have anything equivalent to our modern police force. It didn't have it. It didn't exist yet. When someone was murdered, the members of the family saw to it that the murderer was brought to justice and received his punishment by way of an axe or a spear or some heavy rocks. To understand what is happening here, we need to remember that the Israelites were just becoming a nation. They were learning about who they were. They left slavery behind them nearly 40 years ago, and they're trying to find their identity. I don't know if any of you have ever been in search for your own identity. I'm sure most, if not all of you have at one point looked in the mirror and said, "Who am I?" Now, if a voice from the mirror spoke back at you and told you your name and you heard that, then you need to see either a deliverance minister or a psychiatrist. There's no well-established legal code 3,000 years ago in Israel. No system of lawyers and judges were in place at the time. No elaborate rules for dealing with every possibility. What they did have was the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, with all the laws found there. And however, they were just learning how to put them all into practice. One of the principles dealt with what was to happen in the event someone was maliciously killed. The law dealt with what was to happen in the event of a murder. Someone was deliberately killed. And in the Latin language, the ancient law was called lex talionis, the law of retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. The penalty for murder was death, and it was the right of the family of the person who had been murdered to avenge that death. It wasn't done by the legal system the way it is in our country today. It was carried out by the victim's family. If you've ever heard a victim's family share their pain when a criminal is sentenced, you can imagine the way revenge must have been taken in those days 3,000 years ago. The cities of refuge were based on a principle that is in the basis of our law today. You are innocent until proven guilty. That's what the cities of refuge were all about. A safe haven until the matter can be found out. You know, before this, all too often people would dish out punishment and then get around to asking questions later. I got him. Yeah, he's dead. blood all over the place. Boy, the family will be happy now. And go, hey, Bill, yeah? It's the wrong guy. Huh? Arrest him. So, it was not a good system, and the rules we're reading about here were given as a means of changing that status quo and preventing the death of innocent people who had not really killed the person who lost their life. Having said that, there was still a dead person. However we want to look at the cities of refuge, the laws that God put in place to deal with an accidental death, and someone caused an death unintentionally, accidentally, there was still a dead person. Somebody had died, and their family members were in pain. They were hurting. Was there to be no penalty at all? Should the person involved in their death walk away free? The situation we're talking about here would be called manslaughter in our legal system today. When somebody is killed unintentionally, accidentally. If somebody hits somebody with a car and they die, that's called vehicular manslaughter, as I understand it. Of course, every city and state has their own terminology, but something like that. And but how does mercy relate to the situation? I mean, you don't see a whole lot of mercy within the legal system, and I don't think it's purposely set up that way. It's set up to find the truth of the matter, if at all possible, and to punish those responsible for the crime. Good question, and that's the second major point of today's message. Mercy does not remove the consequences. Just because you're shown mercy doesn't mean there are no consequences to bad behavior. I want you to think about what would have happened when an accidental death took place in those days. The person would have rushed to the gate of the city of refuge, because until they arrived there, a member of the family caught up with him or her, and they were considered fair game. The city leaders would hold their own form of court where they would examine the circumstances surrounding the tragic death to determine the victim's death was accidental or unintentional. They would interview witnesses of the case. If the death was determined to be malicious on purpose, the person was turned over to the victim's family and put to death. But if, on the other hand, death was felt to be unintentional, not by purpose, it was accidental, then the person was permitted to live in the city of refuge. However, from that day forward, they could never safely leave the city that they were in. Because if a member of the victim's family ever caught them outside of that city of refuge, they could be legally put to death. They could be killed with no consequence. Even when sin isn't intentional, there are always consequences. I remember a cartoon from my youth where I think it was Daffy Duck, right? In this cartoon, and in the cartoon, there's he finds a pearl, and I think the genie tells him he has to put it back, or there'll be consequences. And he says, consequences, as long as I'm rich, right? And he walks out of there, and then he gets shrunk. It's about this big. He can't carry the pearl. So, what we're talking about may seem a little harsh, but actually it represented a huge step forward in the legal process. Up to this time, if you were involved even accidentally in a person's death, you were probably almost certainly going to be put to death. I'm sure there were people that never made it to the city of refuge. But things had now changed. Remaining in the city of refuge guaranteed another chance at life. It wasn't the life they wanted. It wasn't the life they had. They had to leave everything they ever knew. All their surrounding friends, neighbors, and everything. They had to go to a city of refuge. It was kind of like the witness protection program in a way. And the person in question here had made mistakes. But thanks to this law, they had another chance at life. And sometimes what appears to be totally unfair really is not. Let me illustrate from Gary Richmond's book, A View from the Zoo. Because in it, it describes the very interesting birth of a giraffe. It says, the typical newborn giraffe falls nearly 10 feet when it's born and lands on its back. Within seconds, the calf rolls to an upright position with its legs tucked under its body. From this position, he considers the world for the first time and shakes himself off. And the mother giraffe lowers her head to make a quick look. And then she positions herself directly over the calf. She waits about a minute and then kicks the baby so that it's sent sprawling head over heels. This violent process repeated over and over again. Eventually, the calf will stand for the first time on its wobbly legs. The mother giraffe does the most remarkable thing. She kicks it off its feet again. Why? She wants it to remember how to get up. In the wild, baby giraffes must be able to get up quickly and stay with the herd where there is safety. If the mother didn't teach her young calf to get up quickly, it would not survive. You see, what the mother giraffe does to her baby may not seem fair. It may seem ugly or cruel to us to look at. But it is essential to the young giraffe's survival. The fact that the person who was guilty of manslaughter had to live in a city of refuge from then on may seem harsh, but it was merciful punishment. Not only that, but it was not permanent. It did possibly not permanent. You see, when the high priest died, the person who had been living in the city of refuge was free. They could go back home, no one could touch him. Thanks to this law, they had been given another chance at life. Numbers 35 verse 28 says, he should have remained in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer shall return to the land of his possession. According to the Torah here, a person guilty of unintentional manslaughter is safe from the blood avenger so long as he remains within the city of refuge. He cannot return to his own property or society at large until the death of the high priest. Interesting point. Apparently, the death of the high priest cancels the blood redeemer's right to exact vengeance. After the death of the high priest, the avenger can no longer strike without consequence. When the high priest died, all the people confined to the city of refuge were free to return home without fear of reprisal. The Torah does not explain why the death of the high priest cancels the blood debt. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't go into it. It just says that's how it is. Apparently, the high priest's death created some form of expiation, as if the death was taken as an exchange in lieu of the death of the guilty person. The death of the high priest sets the confined man free from the city of refuge, satisfies his blood debt, and lifts his fear of retribution. He can go home without a care in the world. He's fine. He's been pardoned. The sin has been paid for. Well, similarly, disciples of Yeshua the Messiah believe that the death of our heavenly high priest erased our debts of guilt and sin. His death set us free from confinement and canceled the claim of sin on our lives. As we continue our discussion today, I make a point that mercy is always significant in the discussion of justice. According to Jewish tradition, the roads leading to these cities were kept in excellent condition, and the crossroads were well marked with signposts that read, Miklat, Miklat, refuge, refuge. Runners were stationed along the way as guides. 3 cities of refuge were on each side of the Jordan. On the west was Kadesh, on the west side, Kadesh, and Shechem was in the middle, Hebron was on the south, on the east side of the Jordan, Golan in the north, in the middle was Ramoth, and Bezer was in the south. So no one was ever that far from the city of refuge. God didn't ignore the fact that justice had to be done. Remember, if the person who came to the city of Refuge had murdered the victim, he was still put to death. However, the person who was guilty of manslaughter still had a chance. There was something even larger going on here, though. And I've looked at the story of the cities of refuge quite many times. But I think that there is something larger going on. And if we're not careful, we will miss it. And I think it's too important to miss. God's intention was that while there must be justice, his people should also demonstrate mercy. You know, there's an old saying by a rabbi from a very long time ago, and he commented saying that if God created the world with only mercy, that evil would just multiply everywhere. I'm paraphrasing here. And then he said, but if God created the world with only justice, then no one would survive. So he created the world with both justice and mercy. Now our focus up to this point has largely been historical. We've been examining what happened and how did it happen and why did it happen and what was going on. We have in fact been laying a foundation here for the remainder, the closing parts of this sermon, because the rest of the time we shared today, I want to issue a very strong challenge to you. We no longer have cities of refuge. Let's be, we could say that there are cities that call themselves sanctuary cities, but I don't think a blood avenger, I don't think a person who killed somebody accidentally could run there and said, protect me, they would get arrested, right? We don't have cities of refuge per se. But my dream, my thoughts, is that the Kehillah would take over that role. That the Kehilot of the world, the congregations of God of the world, would take over the role of the sanctuary cities in more ways than one. And I don't mean that we literally take people out of prison who have been guilty of manslaughter, but we can reach out to people who are struggling and share the message of God's refuge with them through Yeshua's gift of eternal life. There are far too many people who are convinced that believers look down on everyone who isn't like them. You know, I met a man once in the street, and I don't know why he spoke to me. I was waiting for the light to change, and he was there, and he said to me, you believe in God? And I said, yes. He said, are you a Christian? I said, I'm Messianic. He said, Messianic? I said, yes. Messianic, Jewish, we believe in Yeshua. He said, oh, you're Jewish? And I said, yes. He says, oh, you're going to hell. So does he know something I don't know? Got the same Bible? You're Jewish? Yeah, no, you're going to hell. Yeah. Sometimes the perceptions of people who believe that Christians, Messianics, they look down on people who aren't like them. Sometimes these people out there, their perceptions are closer to the truth than I'd like to admit, perhaps more than you'd like to admit. I once read about a Bible teacher who said that the ecclesia was never meant to be a showcase for saints. God intended it to be a hospital for the fallen. And Jerry Scott, who's a pastor, wrote this: America is a lonely place, he said. We rush from appointment to appointment, place to place, and then disappear into our living rooms where our best friend is the TV. Extended families are often shattered by divorce or unable to function because the members are scattered around the country. We no longer have cities of refuge. But especially in the day we live in, our congregation must be a place where we care about people who have failed. And be willing to remind them that the God we serve is a God of refuge and a God of mercy and a God of forgiveness and a God of second chances. Because all people matter to God. There's all kind of signs out there the last few years. These lives matter. Blue lives matter. Orange lives matter. Whatever the sign says. You go, what does that mean? All other lives don't matter? How ridiculous. Every time I see a sign like that on Facebook, I put up my own and say, all lives matter. It's either all or nothing. Everybody's life matters, or no one's life matters. God is not a respecter of persons. He doesn't care about how proud you are of your background. You have a soul, and that soul doesn't have a background. It doesn't care if you eat arroz con pollo or spaghetti and meatballs. Because He created that soul. He fashioned it. He placed it within you. And He will take it from you in the age to come and seat it with Him in the kingdom of heaven. You see, what I'm talking about here is that sometimes we are likely to be challenged to the point where we're a little uncomfortable. And I think it's because there's a truth that we're ignoring. The Kehillah is intended by God to be a modern type of a city of refuge, a refuge for people. But it isn't. Look around you. Everyone sitting here is a believer. And when the fallen come in, we look like disgust on them, instead of saying, welcome to the kingdom of God. Yeshua will forgive all of your sins if you accept Him. Your past is gone. His blood will pay for everything, and you will have a new life in God's refuge, in this city of refuge, starting today. Probably nearly everyone today is thinking in agreement right now. We need to be city of refuge. We need to be open to people who are fallen and need help getting up. But let me tell you that it may be a bit more of a challenge than you would think. And let me illustrate what I'm talking about. We must be willing to reach out to people who are struggling with failure and confusion in their life. We need to be a safe place where people can know that we will share God's mercy and refuge and Yeshua's loving kindness, even if they have really messed up their life. Let me ask a couple of difficult questions. I don't want you to raise your hand with the answer. I just want you to think about this. You're sitting in your seat, and the seat next to you is empty. And somebody sits down just before the service starts, sits down there because they're ushered there. And then you find out, because they tell you a little bit about who they are. What about the divorced mother who comes and brings her children, and without, can she do that without feeling we're going to judge her? Oh, well, where's the dad? Oh, I'm divorced. Oh, really? The person's looking at you, move away to you. Do I? Did I use deodorant? But we tend to judge everybody who's not exactly like us. There was a movie many years ago, 96, I think it came out, and it was called Independence Day. And they did a remake a couple of years back. It was called Independence Day, the alien aircraft and all that. And so at one point, there's nothing more that this little group can do at this air base, and they gather in a little circle and they're going to pray. And the guy leading the prayer is the guy playing Jeff Goldblum's father, is Judd Hirsch from Taxi. And he's got I think he has a kippah on. I don't know if he has a tali, and he's got a Jewish prayer book. And there's people, in a small circle there. And this one guy comes and he says, "Come join us." And he says, "But I'm not Jewish." And Judd Hirsch says, "Nobody's perfect." But it's true though, no one's perfect. It doesn't matter what walk of life we're coming from, because we want to look at them through the lens of, I'm a believer, I'm cleansed and you're not. Then we make them feel bad. What if they never go back into any congregation of God again because we made them feel that way? Can the person who isn't sure that God exists ask their questions without being met with the "how dare he" attitude? What if someone comes in and not sure that God exists? They don't believe in God. You know, I prayed through an entire Yom Kippur service all day long with a man who was an atheist. We were sitting together. His name was Harry. And I'm thinking, like, at one point during the service, we had a little break, and I said, Harry, excuse me for being a little forward, but you don't believe in God? He said, no, I'm an atheist. I said, okay, do you mind me asking what you're doing here when we're praying all day to God we don't believe in? He says, I'm Jewish. Where else could I be? I don't get it, but he's a Jewish atheist. I don't know, it doesn't even make sense to me. But he was there. He got experience in hearing prayer and even being prayed for. That's wonderful. He can say today he doesn't believe that God exists, but he's willing to let people pray for him. There's something in him that's uncertain. He says, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, but something in him says, you might be wrong, man. When people say, can I pray for you? It's like, sure, okay. Good night. To be a city of refuge, a congregation of refuge, means we reach out to people who are fallen and we show them kindness where they are. Our commitment to the truth must be equaled by our commitment to care the way Yeshua cared for the fallen people of his time. And the first part of today's message was focused on understanding the history of what happened, while the last part here, that we're coming closer to the end now, is focusing on putting it into practice in our own lives today. I want to go back into the historical part for a moment, because what I'm getting ready to share illustrates something that's very practical for each of us. There's no record in the scriptures as you search through them. There seems to be no record of the cities of refuge ever being used. We see the design, we see the command, we see the purpose, we see the reasoning, but yet nothing that says they were actually ever used. Which may suggest something for consideration. That we are a lot better at talking about mercy than we are about showing it. We're great talkers about mercy. Let me ask you something. If we want to reach those who struggle, it will probably begin with us being genuine enough to be honest about the fact that we're far from perfect. And are we willing to accept? Are we willing to confess? Are we willing to realize and accept that we are imperfect? Many years ago, I heard the expression FHB, fallible human being. At a time when I was conversing with people, at the time I was doing a study for a group of Catholics. And there was no teacher. And they asked me, would you teach us? And I said, I'm not Catholic. And they said it didn't matter. That I knew the Bible, and they wanted me to help them. And so I said, okay, I'm going to slip up sometimes, because I'm sure things that I believe in teach may conflict. And one of the first things that came up from them was that the Pope is infallible. I said, oh, you mean he's not a human being? And they said, no, he's human. But he's infallible, can't make a mistake. So how can he not make a mistake if he's human? Aren't we made to make mistakes? Isn't part of the way we grow by making mistakes? You know, you're a kid and you learn to ride a bicycle for the first time, and they put training wheels on it. Am I right? Training wheels. And then eventually one day, one of your parents or grandparents or somebody in your family or whatnot takes those training wheels off the bicycle. And they say, go ahead. And what do? You fall on your face. Whoops! It's a training wheel. You got to get used to it. You got to learn now to balance on your own. We make mistakes, and it helps us grow and be better. And what I said is, look, I cannot speak about Catholic doctrine because I don't know about it. I'm not an expert in that area. But what I can tell you is for myself, for me, I am a fallible human being. I make mistakes every day. And that's the way that God teaches me to grow. Let me illustrate with an imaginative story by Tiziana Ruff about an ancient emperor in the Far East. And I have this and one page more and I'm done with my message today. This story is close to the ending. I made the print a little too small here. The emperor decided to do something different. He called all the young people in the kingdom together one day and said, "It's time for me to step down and pick the next emperor. I have decided to choose one of you." And the emperor continued, "I'm going to give each one of you one seed. It is a very special seed, and I want you to go home, plant the seed, water it, and come back 1 year from today with what you have grown from this seed. I will then judge the plants and choose the next emperor of my kingdom." One boy named Ling received a seed that day, like all the others. He went home and excitedly told his mother the whole story. She helped him get a pot and some planting soil, and he planted the seed and watered it carefully. Every day he carefully watered this seed. And after about 3 weeks, some of the other children began talking about how their plants were beginning to grow. And Ling kept checking his seed, but it never grew. 4 weeks went by, and then 5 weeks, but there was still nothing. Ling didn't have a plant, and he felt like a failure. 6 months went by, still nothing grew in Ling's pot. Everyone else now had a tall, beautiful plants growing. But he had nothing. The boy was up. The boy didn't say anything to his friends. He just kept waiting for a seed to grow. And when the year was up, all the young people brought their beautiful, great big plants to the emperor for inspection. Ling didn't want to go, but told his mother that he wasn't going to take an empty pot. But his mother encouraged him to go and to be honest about what had happened. And he took his empty pot to the palace, and when he arrived, he was amazed by all the beautiful plants. So many, so gorgeous, so big. And many of the other kids laughed at his empty pot. And when the emperor arrived, he surveyed the room and greeted the young people. Ling tried to hide in the back. And then the emperor spotted Ling at the back of the room with his empty pot. And he ordered his guards to bring him to the front. Ling was terrified. But the emperor gently asked his name. All the kids were laughing and making fun of him. But then the emperor announced to the crowd, "Behold, your new emperor. His name is Ling." The emperor explained, "1 year ago today, I gave everyone here a seed. I told you to take the seed, plant it, water it, and bring it back to me today. But I gave you all boiled seeds, which could not grow. All of you, except Ling, have brought me trees and plants and flowers. When you found out that the seed would not grow, you substituted another seed for the one I gave you. Ling was the only one with the courage and honesty to bring me a pot with the true boiled seed in it. Behold your emperor." Would you be honest right now about your need for God's help in your life? Would you be honest now? How many people here needs God's help in their life? I need God's help. How many people need God's help in their life right now? Perhaps you desperately need refuge or mercy or forgiveness or a second chance about something. You know what? You're in the right place. God wants to give you exactly what you need right now. Maybe you feel a need to become part of our congregational family or to share a struggle you're currently facing with someone who will pray for you. God is more willing to listen and hear you when you ask Him. Keep walking around in a circle, one waiting for something to happen. It reminds me of a person who used to talk to me often about how they didn't get a job. He was a young kid, about 27, 28 years old. He lived with his parents. And his father was giving him a $20 a week allowance. And I said, why don't you go out and get a job? And I helped him do his resume, and I helped him whatever. Every week was the same. Oh, didn't get a job yet, didn't get a job yet. Finally, I decided to ask him, I said, have you looked for a job? He said, no. I said, but you have resumes. He said, yes. Whenever a friend of the family or somebody comes over, I hand it to them. I said, yeah, but don't you go out there and walk around the area and drop resumes off at stores or go to a job place that can help you? No, I wouldn't do that. He said, you realize how many TV shows I'm going to miss? He said, my mother makes me breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And my father gives me $20 a week. I said, well, why don't you come to the congregation more often? We would pray for you. He said, you realize how big a piece of that $20 a week is I'm going to spend $5 going back and forth to the congregation? I can't do that. God is more willing to listen and hear you when you ask Him. You see, our God is Elohim Miklat, the God of refuge. He is Adonai Machaseh, the God of refuge. He sent us Yeshua as our eternal refuge. In Him is a safe haven for all who call upon His name, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, forever and ever. Yeshua is King. He is our refuge. He is alive and well. And He's waiting for you to call upon Him so He can help you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.